Hello and welcome everyone. I'm James Harding. I'm the editor and co-founder of Tortoise, and welcome to this a timely think-in on whether there is such a thing as a free trial in the UK, a fair trial in the UK, I should say. Just before we started this call, I was talking to both Nazir and Amanda, and I'm going to introduce them in a moment. But I just wanted to say that the idea of our think-ins is that they operate as a news conference, as a news meeting. They're the chance that we get together, all of us, the reporters and journalists at Tortoise, are members who are interested in trying to understand and shape our thinking on the news, and people who've got a depth of expertise, personal experience in a subject, and together we come to a deeper understanding of the issues, and sometimes we'll identify the thread of a story that we should pursue. And we set up Tortoise with an idea that we could do journalism differently, a journalism that's slow and open, and a journalism that would address something that seemed to us everywhere, and that was the power gap. And perhaps this year, 2020, has illustrated the scale of that power gap, more vividly than any of us would have wanted. And so tonight, what we're really trying to do is look at both what's happened in terms of COVID and discrimination, but also in the light of the arguments that are raging around Black Lives Matter and discrimination, and how both of those are going to be filtered through our criminal justice system and in through the courts. And so the real aim tonight is to hear, of course, from Nazir Afzal. Many people will know Nazir. I got to know him when we was at the Times, and one of our great reporters, a guy called Andrew Norfolk, started a reporting project, a piece of reporting on child sex grooming in Rotherham and Rochdale, and it was Nazir who was central as chief prosecutor then and part of the Crown Prosecution Service to pursuing those cases. I got to know him then, but since then he's done a whole host of other things, not least being the chief exec of the UK's Police and Crime Commissioners. And we're joined too by Amanda Pinto, who is the chair of the Bar Council, who's there, if you like, to make sure that our legal system works, that it does what it says it does. And that's no small undertaking when, of course, the courts are suspended and we've moved to a system of remote justice. But the thing I wanted to say is this conversation is going to be better informed by your points of view, your experiences, the direction you think it should be led. And so that's the reason in our think-ins we have this loosely enforced rule, which is no questions. We want to hear what you think, your personal experience perspective. So do weigh in. My colleague Liz Mosley is corralling the chat as it streams alongside the conversation. There is the mighty Liz. Do say things, and actually I'll try and pick up on them and weave them into the conversation that we're having, try and bring you personally into that conversation. I know everyone now has a dab hand at Zoom, so just to say, do hit the participants tab. There's a little grey box. If you want to know, hit it. You'll also be able to raise your blue digital hand. And that way we'll make sure we hear from as many people as possible in the course of the hour. This is being recorded, I just want you to know, but you can see that on your screen. And with that, I'm going to actually come first to Nazir. Sometimes, Nazir, in these think-ins, will often start with a group of members and hear their points of view. But I really, I was reading today about your engagement in the case on Dominic Cummings and the possibility of a legal case against Dominic Cummings. But in the process of reading about that, I also discovered that your brother had died from COVID-19, and I was extremely sorry to hear that. And I just thought, actually, it'd be sort of wrong and odd not to address that first. So I'm sorry to hear that, but I just wanted to hear what had happened and how that shaped your thinking about the government's handling and society's handling of the pandemic.
Well, thank you, James, and thank you to everybody for joining us this evening. Well, I live in Manchester, as you know, James, and my brother and the rest of my family live in Birmingham. And my mother was seriously ill. She's 92, and she was seriously ill with double pneumonia and in a Birmingham hospital until the early March. Early March, they let her go because I think they imagined that the hospital was just going to get inundated with COVID. We don't think she had COVID, although she wasn't tested. If she did, she amazingly survived it. And then my brother and other members of my family visited, I did as well, visited the hospital. And we imagine actually that he caught COVID on one of those visits because one of the women in the next room had COVID. So where else in the hospital, we don't know. He was ill for the best part of 3 weeks. The hospital said, we don't really need you here. They tested him. They didn't tell him the result of the test. They sent him home. And then on the 8th of April, which is the peak day, the most number of people in the United Kingdom that died on one day was the 8th of April, he didn't wake up. And then the next day we learned, one of my nieces is a doctor and asked about the COVID test, and we learned that he tested positive. So we learned he tested positive the day after he died. And in the meantime, of course, his wife and 3 children were living with him whilst he was contagious, for want of a better term, in the home. They weren't given any advice, or I don't blame the health service. You can probably imagine what they were going through at that time. And those of us who, we're Muslims, and traditionally in Islam, you're supposed to bury within 24 hours if you can. That day, because it was so extraordinarily busy is the wrong word, it took 8 hours for the undertakers to come and collect his body from home, because they had something like 31 other bodies to pick up from all over Birmingham. The mosque where he was then kept had to bring in industrial fridges. Thankfully, he wasn't in one of the industrial fridges, but they were using the industrial fridges because of the number of people they had to keep a hold of. The coroner's office had 300 bodies backlogged in it, so it took several days before they were able, despite working throughout the bank holiday, before they were able to issue a death certificate. And then we couldn't find a slot. We were given a 30-minute slot at the cemetery in Birmingham. I couldn't attend because we had a maximum of 6 people that could attend, and I do have 5 brothers and a sister, so I did have 5 brothers and sister, and so I wasn't present at the funeral. They had to take care of it themselves. After 30 minutes, they were told to leave because the next family was coming in to bury their loved one. We've not been able to mourn. The issue, of course, is that tens of thousands of people are in exactly the same boat. They've not been able to mourn. And as you can see, I've been very vocal about not just what happened to my brother. My brother is not. We're not alone in this. None of us are alone in this. But we were told that we were. Was it world-class preparedness? Yes, of course we were, because nobody had any testing. Nobody had any PPE. The hospitals didn't know what to do. As I say, they sent him home to a home where he had 3 children and a wife, and they potentially were subjected to it. The process afterwards was really painful. The lack of the ability to mourn, and the sacrifices we make. I made the sacrifice of not being able to go to my brother's funeral. Any other day, had he been buried any other day, 500 people would have come. Right. And so we couldn't do that. And so from my perspective, what happened in relation to Dominic Cummings is not just personal. It is personal, but it's also everybody else. All of us have, through goodwill and generosity, have made enormous sacrifices in order to ensure that all of us are kept safe. And what struck me was that not only the rights and wrongs of what he did, what happened afterwards was seriously concerning for me. As a former civil servant, I would never have been able to issue a press release, never mind have a press conference in the garden at Downing Street. I would never expect the Prime Minister to shield me in the way he was shielded. I would never expect the lies, writing for the New Statesman, for the Spectator, and we now know that missed out a rather important bit, namely he was in Durham. All of these issues, to my mind, and the fact that the police then carried out, in my view, a very cursory investigation and found that he might have been prosecuted. All of these things damage public confidence. And so the reason why I've instructed lawyers to look at this is because I've been learning stuff. One of the things I've learned, James, is that the police have been written to by MPs, members of parliament. If I was written to by a member of parliament when I was in my former role, we had a protocol. We had to reply within 14 days with a substantive reply. The members of parliament told me they've not even had an acknowledgement from the police when they've been asking for further information. And we also know that, in terms of timelines, very shortly after all of this palaver, the Prime Minister then relaxed the rules on the quarantine, etc. And so all of us have had an impact. I want to get to the bottom of the impact, and I'm relentless generally in trying to find out what the truth is. And so that's what I'm hoping to do, is to actually find out what the truth is. People have said, oh, it should be a private prosecution. I think the law doesn't allow one, because the regulations say only the police and prosecution bring a prosecution. But I'm more keen on understanding what the decision-making tree was, what they knew, what they didn't know, and why it is they seem not want to share the information that they have.
And Nazir, can you just explain what is the legal case? Because it's hard to understand if you're in breach of guidance. That I can completely understand the arguments about his position and the message he needs to send to the country, working in 10 Downing Street, etc. But is there a legal
there's a
case?
The legal case was about, the guidance is there to help lawyers generally interpret what the regulations are, and the regulations were pretty, you know what they were: stay at home, don't take the disease somewhere, isolate for up to 7 or 14 days. That was variable. It was Prime Minister, it was 7 days. The rest of it was 14 days. And it clearly, on the basis of the facts that we know and the facts we don't know, he didn't do any of that. And people tend to forget that at the time he did this, London was drowning in COVID, whilst the Northeast had hardly any. And so the whole principle behind the regulations was to somehow protect the country and people in the country from being exposed to the disease. And the case would be that he broke all that in the journey he took, and the various journeys he took, and potentially exposed those who weren't suffering from the disease to the disease. But as I said, that'll come out in the wash. I'm very keen that we find out the truth, and I'm pretty sure we will.
And Nazir, forgive me, I feel like we're taking, it feels at the moment as though we're dealing with decades of history in the matter of days and weeks. And so I'm going to try and actually also just ask you a little bit about how you read across the murder of George Floyd, the protests in the United States, the protests in the UK, and then bring us, if you like, to our subject, which is the court system. In our newsroom, our digital version of the newsroom, we've been talking a lot about what racism, what prejudice in the UK looks like. Because it doesn't obviously look the same as it looks in the Minneapolis police. It looks different. And I just wondered how you think it worked within the structures of power.
Okay. No, I get that. We mustn't forget that we have got some research that tells us that the COVID has had disproportionate effect on minorities. Strange as I've discovered just today, it's having a similar effect on minorities in the United States of America. So the disease isn't racist. What's racist, in my view, is the lack of planning and the fact that very often people from minorities are at the front line. They're often working in front-facing activity, even in hospitals, or if not, in general community. But the read across is power. I've said today that it's not about leave or remain. We're not divided by that. We're not divided by black or white, nor by man and woman, or for that matter, north and south. What we're divided by is by those who have power and who can access and use power, and those who don't. And my brother didn't have any. He might have been, he spent his whole life dedicated, well, half of it to public service, but he didn't have any power. He wasn't able to say to the hospital, keep me in, he wasn't able to say, look, get me the best treatment you can get. As I said, he didn't find out he never found out. We didn't find out that he was tested positive until the day after. So power is the issue here. The same thing with George Floyd. I have no doubt all of us at some point have passed a counterfeit note, because there's so many out there in the world. He passes a counterfeit note. He gets stamped on for the best part of 9 minutes, whilst other officers are around there, but people are saying, let him go. There was no justification for that. And then you read across to, say, the murder in the church where I can't remember his name now, the young man who killed 9 black people in their church. And he was led out of the church. He wasn't stood on his neck. He was led out of the church wearing a bulletproof vest, and they bought him a Burger King at the police station. He was white. You then ask yourself, what is going on here? Is there a disproportionate differential treatment? And of course, in the UK, we've had the David Lamy's report in 2017, which was commissioned by Prime Minister at that time, we've been through so many, David Cameron. And Lamy's report making it abundantly clear that if you are black, you are more likely than a white person to be stopped, to be arrested, to be detained without bail, to be charged. You're more likely to be convicted. You're more likely to be sent to prison. You're less likely to be rehabilitated. You're more likely to reoffend. It's throughout the system. Yeah. And, Lamy had 100 recommendations. And as we've been learning over the last 24 hours or so, hardly any of them have been actioned. So you have to, the read across is those in power want to preserve their power. And then when we confront them with the evidence that suggests otherwise, they are very slow in responding. And, as a minority myself, and across the country and across the world, people lack confidence. And, the point with Cummings as well is that if there are no consequences to breaking the law for certain people, then why should anybody else comply? Why should we?
And that's it. So I want to bring in Amanda in a moment, but I also want to hear from our members. So points of view, just do weigh in. But Nazir, can I ask maybe a deeply naive question? Is there a bias, a racism in the courts, in the decisions that judges make, in the way that prosecutions and defences are handled? Or do you think that there is, if you like, a more subtle prejudice or power gap in the allocations of resources in the process of our legal system? How does unfairness work in our courts?
It's not either or, James. It's both. I've written some examples. There are some examples in my memoirs where I talk about, for example, a district judge standing in front of me, and I tell the judge that the man who's now appearing as first appearance has no previous convictions. He looks at me and says, "You must be wrong." And I'm saying, "Well, my file says no previous conviction." He goes, "You must be wrong. Check it." I look behind me, and obviously the person coming up from the cells, whom I didn't know, was black. And I thought, hang on a minute, you are bringing your bias and assuming that this person has previous convictions when he doesn't. And one of the last things I did, James, as a prosecutor, was to ensure that a district judge that appeared in Preston, who told one of my lawyers to get this witness to court on a particular day, and when the lawyer said the witness, is not available, he said, "Miss Patel, she must surely only be working in a grocery shop," and that's the kind of prejudice, unconscious or otherwise, which too many people face and feel. And those are examples I have seen with my own eyes, never mind what others have experienced and what perceptions they may have. And we can try and drill it out of people, and we can train them on unconscious bias, and there's good work here in terms of the number of minorities who are now reaching the bench, for example, and becoming judges. Some grew up with me. I remember when they were baby barristers often, and so now they're high court judges, and it's fantastic that's happening. But we have a system still where the people who are racist or who behave in a racist way are either excuses are made for them, or little is done in terms of action, or they're able somehow to cover it up because the system doesn't really question their decision making. And I don't know what the answers are. I can see the questions. Part of the answers is about a more diverse bench. Part of the answers is about shouldn't. I mean, Amanda will talk about this, I'm sure. It's so difficult to get into the law these days at a time when we need more people from minorities in the law because it's so expensive, and the income isn't there, and the work isn't there. Legal aid has been slashed, etc. So it is tough to get that diverse group of people in that role. Do we need to re-engineer our system? Perhaps. The Americans have a separate line for judiciary. You don't become a barrister or a lawyer, a solicitor, and then become a judge. You can become a judge straight away, almost out of law school. Is that the thing that we want? Maybe that's what we'll do in order to deal with a diversity issue. But these are big questions that need answering.
Well, Nazir, thank you. As you've been talking now, suddenly it's been this there's this kind of hush in the chat, and then suddenly in the last 5 minutes, there's a ton of people who are having things to say. So I want to bring those in. But first, I'd really love to hear from you, Amanda. And I know that your career in the law has come, if you like, at the other end of the power gap. A lot around money and abuse of money in our system, but can we start with how you see the courts reacting both to COVID and to the points that Nazir was making around fairness and prejudice in the criminal justice system?
Yeah, so thank you very much. I mean, I think what is interesting at the moment is that COVID is definitely having an effect on fairness and access to justice. And it's definitely having more of an effect, I think, or risks having a greater impact on how diverse the professions are and how diverse the judiciary is in the long run if we're not very careful. And you're talking about lack of investment, how difficult it is for people from BAME or non-traditional backgrounds to make a career out of being a lawyer. And in particular, actually, at the bar, which is the feeder for the senior judiciary. And I'm looking at the chat and I can see people saying it's positions of power that are so hard to get to. And what we need to do is to change the system all the way through and support professional careers all the way through, in order that you don't have the kind of remarks that Nazir was talking about from the judiciary. Obviously, that's only one side of it. That's, if you like, the professional side of it. I think ultimately, what we're seeing is, for my part, I think that cases are typically, I mean, I was horrified, honestly, to hear what Nazir just said. But I think if one's looking at criminal justice, the prejudices and the unconscious bias that happen before you even get to being arrested, probably. And at the point of arrest and the way that the process goes, it's clear from the statistics that there are problems in people being treated equitably. But if I could then just come on to the impact of COVID-19, because
yes, please, Amanda, yeah.
in the criminal justice system, a decision was made about 10 years ago to slash the budget of the Ministry of Justice and the Crown Prosecution Service, and indeed the police. And where other departments had protected budgets, they did not. And what that meant was endless underinvestment in the system. And it came, you could say, to a first head anyway, with LASPO, a statute which removed lots of areas of legal aid and also decimated, actually, the amounts of money that people were able to earn in the professions. And it made access to justice for ordinary people who needed help, who couldn't afford legal advice. It made it very, very difficult for them to have representation by people from across the spectrum. And I think that has been a really significant backdrop to what is now happening with COVID-19, because already coming into the pandemic, there was a backlog of 40,000 cases. It's rising at 1,000 cases a month. And we know what the impact of delay is on the quality of justice that comes out at the other end, because people who are witnesses or complainants, victims in cases, defendants who are waiting, who are accused of a crime, the longer that they have to wait, the less engaged they are in the whole process. And quite often we're finding people are literally leaving cases, perfectly decent cases, and saying, I just don't want to have this hanging over me for another 2 years.
And Amanda, sorry, forgive me, can you just tell us a little more about that? 40,000 cases, there's a backlog of 40,000 cases, 1,000 added a month. Can one person have lots and lots of cases? Or when you talk about 40,000, is that 40,000 individuals or organisations who are sort of in limbo waiting for a case? And what's the average time of delay? Is it 3 months, or is it, as you say, 2 years?
So, well, to answer your first question, it will be way more than 40,000, because you'll have the person who's accused of the crime, you'll have the person who's the victim of the crime, you'll have the witnesses, you'll have all the police officers who are typically part of the process, you'll have the lawyers, so there are lots of, and of course you've got the families and all of the other problems that surround themselves quite often with criminal justice. And we're not in a silo. Everything that happens in criminal justice has an impact elsewhere, and that's one of the frustrations, actually, I think, of the budgets being separate. Is you might save money in justice, but you'll be spending it on mental health, or you'll be spending it somewhere else.
Amanda, thanks. I'd love to come back to that, and I think there'll be people who've got points on that. But I wanted to pick up on a point that Mohammed Suhail had made, and see if I could bring in
Hiya.
Mohammed. You there? Hey, Mohammed.
Yeah, I'm here.
Well, I was going to make your point, but you're going to make it better than me. So go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's basically we have a system where there is more representation in terms of BAME people in the judiciary and on the bar and on firm boards and so on. But the people who have the political power to actually change these things, they're the people who aren't willing to do the necessary things to actually create a system that's less prejudicial and more fair. I mean, this is coming from someone who studies law, and I'm a law student at the University of Manchester, and hopefully will go into the law at some point. Following the footsteps of people like Nazir, who've laid the foundations out so wonderfully for people like me. But when it comes to people from my not only race but from my class and my background, working class people, you see from what we were speaking about before, the cuts to legal aid, it's BAME working class people who are affected the most by this. And I just see it as there's this intersection of race and class that isn't really spoke about as much, and it's something that we have to do quite a lot to tackle. It's going to be hard, and much like anybody else here, I don't have all the answers. But I think the number one step is getting people into positions of power, not only within the judiciary, but within politics as well, or having political voices who are able to actually put forward policies to change these things.
Thank you, Mark. I'm gonna put that point to Nazir. What do you think?
Now unmuted. Yeah, I'm now. Mohammed's absolutely right. I mean, I didn't have anybody that looked like me in the law when I was growing up. All right, it was a hell of a long time ago. But, there was nobody, you generally, your role models are people either in your vicinity or in your social groups or in your community, but I had none. And so, I had Atticus Finch or Perry Mason. Those are my role models, or Mahatma Gandhi or Nelson Mandela. They're all lawyers. But so I'm glad that Mohammed feels that there are now people who are his role models, or people who've shown that it's possible. But let's not be. I'm not going to be rose-tinted optimist here. It is extraordinarily difficult. Back in the day, I felt as a Muslim, I didn't want to go down the pub every Friday night, but that was where people wanted to take you, because that was where the opportunities apparently were for work that was coming your way, and that culture deters groups from minorities generally, and so I found it a real struggle. It doesn't matter that you might reach, chief prosecutor, whatever it might be. I felt racism. Every single decision I took, James, somebody somewhere would have a go at me, and it wasn't because of my decision. The decision, even in the Rochdale case that you referred to, James, far right came for me. Why did they come for me when I put it all right? They came for me because I was brown, and it's easier for me. And so, unless you have support networks or resilience or whatever it is, whatever that word is, you will undoubtedly feel the wrath of those people who see us as being different, and that's why it's important to have networks and important to get support around you.
And Nazir, the point that Amanda made about the LASPO legislation and the impact on legal aid and overall funding of the justice system, we all know the sort of old cliche, justice delayed is justice denied. Is it denied to a specific group of people? Do we think that the withdrawal of legal aid and the backlog affects a particular group of people more than others?
I think absolutely. I mean, domestic violence victims, rape victims, they have to wait 12 months, 18 months, whatever it is for a trial. If you're relatively wealthy, and again, there are experiences I can share. Some of the lawyers took out of my book because they were relatively famous people. But if you've got the ability to buy the best lawyers you can possibly get and then drown the prosecution, which is their right, is well within their rights, to enable the case to not necessarily proceed or to proceed at great speed, you can do that. If you are necessarily, I think you made the point, if you are either poor or classes against you in some way, shape or form, and you don't have the networks and the contacts, then it will be more difficult. Then it's easier for them to say your trial's in 18 months time rather than in 6 months time. Or it's easier for them to say that maybe the trials can be reduced in a such a way. So I think there's, this is in the system. It's happening, and it's happening now. And it's happened for as long as I remember. People seem to simplify and think it's all about Freemasonry, but it's none of that. I'm sure that exists in small parts, but it's people with power, people with funds can get justice more speedily. And those of us, those people, and the vast majority of us who don't have that kind of access, I'm afraid are going to have to wait. And as you say, delay means, as Amanda says, delay means you often lose interest or you forget, and all manner of things happen, which means that you won't get justice.
Nazir, thank you. I see that Avril Moore, Amanda, I'm going to come back to you just in 1 minute, if I might. I see that Avril Moore's got her hand up. And also I wanted to pick up on a comment that Nikki Gorb had made, to your point, Amanda, about the backlog. Avril, hello.
Hi.
Hi. A beautiful evening there.
Yeah, there was just a couple of things I wanted just to comment on, really. First being about the George Floyd case, and that, you know, yes, I believe 2 of the police have been sort of charged with second-degree murder and manslaughter. But it is the case, I think, that no police officer has ever been given jail time in America for brutality. And I wonder whether this is going to be a difference, you know, whether there will actually be an actual, you know, there's been charges, but will there be a prosecution? And will the sentence be proportionate to what it would have been had it been, you know, another type of person that was being charged? We'll have to wait and see. And also, I mean, I think in this country, you know, I've been speaking to people that I know, so Black people that I know, and it's almost like a lot of them are going through an absolute trauma at the moment, because this has brought up so much pain from their past that they're now sort of reliving and going through, and it's just horrible and just desperate that they're sort of having to relive everything again. And I think that the justice system in this country, with the cuts that have been made to legal aid over the last sort of 2 years, it is very unfairly weighted to, not necessarily, I don't know, but if you've got money, you know, you can get off with a charge, or you can have your case sort of kind of, you know, really defended well. Whereas if you haven't, things do protract. And I noticed that over the weekend that the chap, I think it was today that it was announced that the chap that urinated on the policeman's memorial over the weekend has been sentenced today to 2 weeks in prison. So he got through the legal system very, very quickly when it was politically expedient. But other things sort of just get pushed to the back of the list. So.
But Avril, thank you for making that point. And actually, as you were speaking, my colleague Alexi Mostras was making a similar point. I'm going to come to you, Amanda. I'm just going to ask Alexi to make the same point, because I think for many of us, the system by which what goes into court, what gets heard, is a mystery, and it's a question of whether that system itself is fair and well run. Alexi, do you want to just make the point, then I'll hand over to Amanda?
Sure. Thank you. We hosted a ThinkIn a few weeks ago with Dr. Natalie Byram, who worked at the Legal Education Foundation, and she was launching a consultation on the impact on the justice system of COVID-19. And it was really interesting, because what seems to have happened is that the divisions that the legal aid cuts a few years ago created, which effectively created a series of backlogs and problems, especially in the lower courts, have been exacerbated by a really, really quick move to online justice. So what the people in this ThinkIn were telling us, who worked at law centres and in a lot of the lower courts, was that you had this situation where there were huge backlogs building up in areas such as housing and debt. And litigants in person in particular were not being given the support they needed to get a fair trial in a remote justice system. But that contrasted incredibly significantly with the higher courts, with the commercial courts, where London is obviously in a leading international position. In the commercial courts, there was a tweet today which said that 150 cases have been held remotely, and only 4 had been adjourned for non-COVID reasons. So I think that the evidence suggests that the move towards remote justice is welcome in some senses, but it has real implications for whether certain people can get fair trials all the time.
Alexi, thank you. Amanda, can I put that back to you? I mean, both Avril's point about the man who urinated on the memorial, but also just the commercials versus lower courts. It does seem like a mystery.
So just in relation to the man that urinated, there are priority listings in all courts at the moment, which are new. They are to do with the pandemic. And one of the things that is obvious, I would say, is that the government is very keen to stamp out any kind of social unrest. And whereas typically an offence such as that might end up having a first hearing, and then it might go off, even if the person pleaded guilty, for reports to see whether there was a non-custodial disposal. Actually, there's a political imperative, if you like, to ensure that this kind of conduct must be dealt with immediately. And we've seen that before. We saw that in the riots, actually, that it really changed sentencing, if you like, for the moment,
yeah.
and also the way in which it was dealt with. I'm interested in the way that the commercial court versus the lower courts issue has been raised, because it is absolutely right that the commercial court has coped far better, and no doubt it's coped far better because of money, because it's got investment, because the parties have got money. They're able to get technology that works. I mean, this is all working swimmingly, but I can tell you that I was doing a hearing recently, which was a remote hearing, and with the best will in the world, it took a very, very long time for all the technology to join up in the Crown Court, and that was with a number of different parties, actually all over the place, but that didn't really matter. All sorts of technical hitches, and I think it's just that there is a level of lack of investment over the years that has to be corrected, and a light has been shone on it actually by COVID-19. But it is true to say that there have been swathes of cases that have been adjourned, so put off, when ordinarily they would have gone ahead. That is not necessarily that they couldn't be heard remotely in a perfectly fair and proper way. If it's an interlocutory hearing, a hearing that isn't the final disposal with witnesses who are accused of being dishonest or something like that, where actually it would not be right necessarily to have a hearing over a telephone or over a video link. But there are also cases which could have happened and haven't happened. And I think that is a kind of collision of the enormous speed at which the pandemic hit, and the lack of resources in the system generally to be able to get this up and running. So that you need to train the judiciary, you need to get the infrastructure, and none of that's had any investment. And that is why I think the commercial court, where they do have the investment, and they have had the investment, they were able to make a success of it. But I do think it's important to just add that there are some sorts of hearings which simply shouldn't be heard. In the last few weeks, we've found out the hard way that they don't make for good justice. So I think that's important to bear in mind.
Amanda, before we finish, I want to make sure that we sort of identified what we think of those cases that really shouldn't be heard now, because I think there is a risk there. I'd like to come to a few people who've had their hands up. Nikki Gorb, then Twome's made a point, I hope I pronounced his name right, and Maya Campbell. I'm going to start, if I might, though, with Nikki. Nikki, I do this rather hesitantly, and forgive this sort of preamble. When I was at the Times, we campaigned for a long time on greater transparency around the family courts, but know that there are still really tight reporting restrictions. And so I saw in the chat that you were going through one of these cases. I know you'll be aware of what those restrictions are, but I was just struck by the fact that you'd had a hearing. You then said you'd gone back to a second hearing that seemed to do exactly what the first one had done. So without getting into the details of the case, can you just tell us what you think the problem is in the process?
Yes, so I was just expecting in the second hearing that I paid my lawyers a lot of money to support me with, that it didn't actually go to the judge, it went back to the legal advisor. So the process didn't progress at all. I was a lot of money out of pocket. And also none of us knew when we went into that hearing that the judge wasn't available. So I just find that, first of all, I'm funding this myself. It's taken me many years to sort of pluck up the courage to do it. And then you go to the hearing and your money is wasted, your time is wasted, and you just feel a despair of, can I continue with this? Can I afford to do it? So there was obviously a lack of judges in the system, based on what we've all been talking about, that the system is overloaded. But then this,
and just out of interest, how long has the process that you've been engaged in run for?
it's actually been quite quick, and it was a telephone remote hearing. So it started, the case was lodged in February, and that's into the second hearing, and so it's been quite fast.
Right.
So it's not so much the speed, but the sort of it's the wrong people are in the wrong hearings, which puts, right. That's the point, really.
And a confusion at exactly what's getting done and by whom.
Yeah, yes, but as soon as you don't know what's happening until you're actually in the hearing, and neither the lawyers, nor the applicants, the respondents were even aware of that. I mean,
and just Amanda's point, what do you feel about having this case heard remotely? Do you feel as though justice can be done remotely? Did you hear me, Nikki? The question was...
sorry, it's to me, the question.
Yes, it is, yeah.
Do I think it can be done remotely? I think at this stage it is, but when you go to final hearings, no, I don't think so. I don't think that's fair. It's maybe those first initial hearings, if you have a lawyer representing you, yes, I think if you are representing yourself, I think it's very difficult indeed.
Okay. Nikki, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Ben Toomey, Ben has been kind enough to message me to say that actually you pronounce his name the number 2, M-E. He's one of the very few people who can actually take his name and use both the numeral and letters to make sure I pronounce it correctly. So Ben, with that introduction, you say that you're a candidate to be one of the police and crime commissioners in Warwickshire, is it?
Right. That's right, yeah.
So what do you think, because, you know, if you did win election, this would be one of those real, it would be up to you actually to try and make a difference here. How do you think you can?
Yeah, well, I've been fortunate to work for 3 different police and crime commissioners across the country before. And one of the things that immediately springs to mind is stop and search, because Amanda was rightly saying earlier that the problems come in before court. And when I was leading on stop and search in the West Midlands, we found that the disproportionality was significantly greater for the stop and searches compared to when it actually came to arrests and prosecutions and then convictions. So that big problem comes in really early. And I think there's plenty of things that you can do about that. There's also, you know, the Lammy report recommends diversion schemes to try and keep people out of court so that you don't have these issues. And there's different ways of doing that to address some of the different ways in which diverse groups of people respond to the court system. So, for example, black men were found to be less likely to plead guilty early on in a case because they didn't trust the court system. So you get rid of that need to accept guilt in order to enter a diversion scheme where you can get the support that you need around treatment or for addictions or housing, for example, that kind of thing that actually reduces reoffending in the long term. Another thing that you could probably do is to look at the makeup of the police. This is something Nazir said as well, in the court system, but also in the police, to make sure it reflects your community is better. The rate of progress in that is way too slow. So that I think there needs to be more drastic positive discrimination in that field, because it's such a crucial area to see that communities are reflected properly.
Okay, Ben, thank you very much. I'm gonna forgive me, Nazir and Amanda, I'm gonna come back to you in a second, but there are a bunch of hands up. I'd love to come to Maya Campbell, and then I see that Rachel and Rani does. So Maya, if you go first. Hi there.
Hi. Yeah. So I don't really want to talk about the racial element of access to justice, because honestly, I think that we're not at a place where we can have that conversation until there is greater representation. It's pretty much a losing battle. I mean, even in the discussions that we have around race, I think there are the discussions within the Black activist community, the Black community, and then everywhere else. And I think that we're trying to talk to each other more, but it's still not a place where we can make any real change. But in terms of access to justice, I kind of wanted to ask a question, not a question, state my opinion, I suppose, and see what you guys think, around judicial review and sort of the prospects of judicial review of the government's handling of this crisis. Yeah. I mean, I had some dealings with the government during a class action climate change case where from my perspective, they looked at the climate science and they chose to ignore it. And I think that, you know, parallels can be drawn when it comes to the pandemic, because, you know, they had the report, they knew what steps they had to put into place to kind of mitigate these things when they did arise, and they didn't do that. And so given, you know, after all the Brexit cases, people were saying, you know, judicial review is out the window, it's not a political matter, all of this stuff. What impact, I suppose, my personal view is that judicial review should be used to look at things like this. But I don't know whether it will be, I suppose.
Are you a lawyer, Maya?
No.
I mean, the interesting thing is we had a conversation about this a week ago. We were thinking about what are going to be the sort of front lines in the battle on climate. And one of the things that's really striking is how organised lawyers are becoming post Heathrow around taking on some of these projects and big businesses. So, you know, if you want to weigh into the work that we're doing on that, we'd love to hear from you. But I'm just going to go back to pardon?
You know, the Plan B organisation?
No, I don't. What's Plan B doing?
Plan B was one of the groups that brought that Heathrow case, and also sort of challenged the government on our Climate Change Act as well. Okay. But I can send you some stuff after this. That'd
be great. Yeah, do. Or feed into the chat, or do email me. I'm james@tortoisemedia.com. Nazir, though, would you just pick up that point? Judicial review. You know, it's one thing to say there's going to be potentially a prosecution, even a private one, against Dominic Cummings. Maya's right, isn't there? There is a moment here where you could do something that's much more thorough. The risk is you end up in a situation David Lammy's in, where you've done a big review and the recommendations go nowhere. So what would be your view of judicial review, public inquiry?
Personally, I'm very much in favour of judicial review as a way of keeping governments in check, or public authorities in check. I think it's really important that we use traditionally it's something that we wanted to use and we have used. There are a lot of things coming out of this, James. You know, for example, I've been asked about corporate manslaughter charges against health trusts who've not been able to provide PPE to their staff. Was the issue of herd immunity, whether or not that's something that needs to be assessed potentially. There are all manner of legal options available going forward. As I say, some things have time limits, some things don't have time limits. But I think that absolutely, I think that there will be consequences. There need to be consequences when we look at how the government have handled or mishandled, in some cases, the way this whole pandemic has been dealt with. And of course, judicial review is a very useful tool in relation to that. Can I just, do you mind if I go back to something that was said earlier on? We were talking about the young man, the Tottenham Hotspur fan that was pissing on a terrible monument today, or a couple of days ago, and the speed with which it was dealt with, and reference was made to the riots in 2011, the disorders in 2011. My view, there's a difference here. I was responsible in large part for the criminal justice response back in 2011. And the reason why we did bring in night courts and the reason why we expedited hearings was because the police had 4,000 people in their cells and not enough cells. And that was the driver. The driver was that we had a duty of care to all the suspects, the prisoners, to the police and everybody else for that matter. And the speed was necessary in order to free up spaces so that people could be processed and people could be kept safe. So that was the main driver, rather than it being seen as a messaging thing, i.e. let's send a message, stop you from rioting or whatever it may be. That was a consequence. It did have that impact, but it wasn't the main driver. I want to make that very clear that it never entered my head that we were going to send a message out to bad guys or to people who were carrying out disorder or protest. I very much strongly believe in protest, but that was a consequence that led from that. But I just want to make that clear that it wasn't, we had a very different approach back in 2011.
Nazir, thank you. Rani Das, I'm going to come to you if I might, and then to Rachel too, who's got their hand up. Right.
Hi.
Hi there. Yeah, hello.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you great.
Okay. Thank you. I wanted to make a couple of points. First of all, I thought what Amanda was saying about...
Rani, would you just speak up a little, because we could hear you, but only faintly.
Is that better?
Much better, yes.
Okay, sorry. I wanted to make a point that what Amanda was saying about the cuts I agree with that. I think that's had quite a bad impact on things. I have recently gone through a family court process. It started last July. I was a litigant in person because I wasn't entitled to legal aid. The case was a private one, and it also involved local authorities who were giving who were on the side of the person who brought the case, which was my ex-partner. And I found it extremely it wasn't so difficult to go through the case itself and get my witness statements and things like that, but I wasn't taken seriously as a litigant in person. And I found the whole process took a very, very long time. It was prolonged, and there were so many discrepancies in how it was heard and the outcome of the case. It was to do with my daughter. I also found that the perception of myself as a person, I don't know if it had to do with perceptions of ethnicity and single woman, I'm not sure, but I found that was also quite stressful, and some of the comments that were made. The whole thing, I found the judiciary, some of the judges to be, with all due respect, very snobby, and it was a very unfair process. And I think if I'd had legal aid, I would like to have thought that I wouldn't have lost the case. Yeah, it was just a really difficult thing to go through. I'm also going to have to go through something, try and put the case back again, but it's not easy. And when all the budgets are cut, I think it has had a negative effect, because if you are entitled to, I think like Nazir said, if you can afford really, really good barristers and solicitors, then almost anything is possible. That was apparent to me during the hearing that I've been through.
Yeah, Ronnie, thank you. Thanks so much for talking about that, and also just making it feel so vivid. You describe it in a way that you can't help but feel exactly, or at least a little of what you felt. So thank you. I'm only going to cut your forgive me because we've come just towards the end, and I want to make sure we hear from Rachel, who's had her hand up, and then we'll come back to Amanda and Nazir. Rachel.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi. I just wanted to say I'm a survivor of the family courts and domestic violence, and I'm doing a PhD now because of my experience looking at experts and female survivors of the expert in private law family court proceedings. I wanted to say that I can't talk about much of my case, obviously, as you pointed out, but on the day that my daughter was removed from my care in the courts, I was denied any access to legal help. It went to appeal, but the hearing and the title of this tonight made me think about my own experience of justice, which has then, I've had to try and understand that to the point where I'm doing a PhD, and it's only 2 years on that I'm understanding the justice system from a family law point of view, but it's taken me to do that, to understand it as a litigant in person, and then before that having access to private law legal help. What always amazes me is that whenever I see or hear presentations about criminal justice, family law comes up time and time again. And I wonder whether we should be opening the conversation up more and more to, I know there's a push for a public inquiry, and there are several inquiries in-house in the family courts by the president, but it strikes me that there's a real issue, and that there are so many women and men that come to these forums to talk about their experiences of family law and family courts. And of course, there's a crossover between family law and criminal law as well, particularly in domestic violence cases where there could be criminal proceedings in one court, but family law proceedings and different standards of proof. So I just wanted to bring that out and wonder whether it's your experience as well, that time and time again, when a criminal justice discussion is brought about, that family law comes up time and time again.
Rachel, yes, thank you. I'm going to just talk about the family courts at the end, once we've heard again from Amanda and Nazir, because as it happens, at Tortoise, one of the things we've done is run a series of investigations into the family courts, family separation, state treatment of people in the family courts. So I'll flag it up, but in the last couple of minutes, I just want to make sure we hear once more from Amanda and Nazir. Amanda, can I just play to you one particular issue that's recurred through the whole conversation, which is about power at the bar, right? Who's represented at the bar and who's not, and how much do you think the bar is seeking to change the groups of people? You know, to Maya's point, you know, actually you've got to change, and I think Lisa G made the same point, you've got to change the people at the bar if this is going to change at all.
Well, if you're talking about getting greater diversity at the bar and better representation of the society we serve, I completely agree. And actually, before COVID-19, that was one of my ambitions for the year, and I'm trying to bring in lots of programs even now. In fact, it's all the more important in my view now that COVID-19 has struck, and it's brought forward and to the forefront the inequities in the system. And for my part, I want there to be proper representation of society across the bar from the very beginning, right up to the top, in sufficient numbers that there will be a good pool of representative people to go into the judiciary, to go into the senior judiciary. I don't actually agree that we need to have a separate siloed judiciary. I think a judiciary that's had legal experience in either as a solicitor or barrister is actually a very good grounding, although you need different skills to be a judge. But I genuinely feel that until we get a better cross-section of society in the professions, and they stay in the professions, retention's a really big problem. And one of the reasons why I think it is a problem, apart from the ones that people have already identified, such as you know, it's very difficult to get in. When you get in, there may well be unconscious bias, but also things like fair allocation of work, all those little things that detract from a great career. All of those matter, and it seems to me that the answer is that we've got to keep plugging away to ensure that that change comes sooner rather than later.
Amanda, thank you. And Nazir, give us something, if you might, at the end of this conversation that we can do. If there's a channel of activism, if there is a case, if there is a project you think that's worth working on to move the dial on fairness in the courts.
I think something was said earlier on around diversion. There are far too many cases in the system, quite frankly, that should have been dealt with by a restraining order or drug treatment or some other, if those services were available. You know, the reality, James, is that we've had a decimation of policing and justice over the last 10 years. Not only when you lose 20,000 police officers, you lose we lost 500,000 years of experience. And when you've lost, we lost, you know, 25% of prosecutors, and we've lost all that legal aid money, et cetera, et cetera. So we are in the depths, I think. And the pandemic couldn't have come at a worse time because we were hoping to get out of this because the government committed apparently to spending some money that they'd taken away previously. So that would have an impact. I think we need more transparency in the system. I've been doing some work in rule of law reform in Pakistan and Somalia. Isn't it strange that both of those developing countries have more interest in the work I'm talking about when I'm talking about transparency, when I'm talking about technology, when I'm talking about remote hearings, than I can ever experience here? Why is it? I don't understand. We have vested interests. We have historical, traditional ways of doing stuff. People will still want to wear their wigs and their gowns, and it makes it really challenging for the public to be part of the system that's working on their behalf. So I think the more that we shine a light on what's going on, you know, I personally believe we should be live streaming every hearing subject to protection of vulnerable people, because that's, back in the day, you used to sit in the public gallery. People don't do that anymore. The more we see of what's happening in our name as far as justice is concerned, the more likely it is that we're going to bring the change.
Nazir, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. If you've not been to a ThinkIn before, at the end of it, the editor, me or one of my colleagues who's editing, tries to say, right, well, as a result of this, here's what we think. The truth is, after an evening like this, I'm sort of overwhelmed by thoughts, and so they're not particularly coherent. But I would like to make just two observations and just a small sort of practical point. You know, just to say, Rachel, to your point, and actually Nikki raised this too, and Rani, you raised it too. You know, one of the really striking things for us has been, how do you tell stories? If you think about most newsrooms, they tell the story of a moment, right? Our job is to try and tell stories over time and to tell stories of developments. And that's one of the reasons we try not to tell quote unquote stories. We open files into particular subjects. And one of the files we opened was on family separation, how the state uses its power to separate parents and children, and the way in which that's done with a level of secrecy and with such difficulties to get transparency and understanding. And my colleague Polly Curtis, who's been the editor on this, has written a good deal about it. We've held a series of think-ins, but it doesn't stop. And in fact, she's just been commissioning to write a book about this. So I think the more that we can begin to understand it, the better. And we will go back in a series of further think-ins to look specifically at the family courts. Just to round up on what we've talked about this evening, I think there's something very practical for us to do, which is to look more deeply at the issue of budgets and money. There's the LASPO issues, but there's the backlog point that Amanda was making, the 40,000 backlog increasing, 1,000 a week. It's just an incredible number. I'm really struck by things in the chat. I just saw Rosie Philpott making a point about how many cases are not coming to court simply because of the changes in legal aid, and the point that Nazir just made at the end there about the reduction in the number of prosecutors and the impact on our legal system. I suppose the thing is that often what we want to ThinkIn to do is to deliver us up, if not a story, a scene that's worthy of investigation. And it feels to me as though we've got one that's very clear in the legal consequences of COVID. Right? So we started with the conversation that Nazir opened in the light of, the loss of his brother and the possibility of a prosecution against Dominic Cummings. But actually, if you think about it, that was the thread that ran through the whole conversation. We talked about judicial review and the ways in which we may or may not hold the government accountable. I saw that my colleague Tess Murray was asking exactly that same question, given what the government knew about the spread of the disease and the impact that it was having in society. I'm really interested in things like corporate manslaughter cases. We know after the financial crisis, there was an increase in litigation. Most likely after this crisis, we'll see that too. Where will that come? And I'm really struck by the point that Nazir made at the end about live streaming. It doesn't need to be the case that the one beneficiary of the technological change of the crisis is Netflix. We could end up in a world where we really do think about a much more accessible justice system that's much more visible to a wider group of people. So the legal consequences of COVID seems like a scene that we should look into, and we will take it from here. And as we get closer to a story, I hope that we'll be able to come back and talk about it again in this, what's in effect our open news meeting. We can't, forgive me, Amanda or Nazir, applaud you. If you'd seen the comments though in the chat, you know that you're getting plenty of applause. And in the absence of applause, what we can do is wave you gratefully off. So thank you very much. Have a very good evening, everyone.